Imagine you're now a doctor living under a totalitarian regime. Your government orders you to participate in medical experiments on prisoners. You know that innocent people will suffer, you know that some of them will die. If you refuse to participate, you will know someone else will take your place. If you obey and then tell yourself, I did not create a system, I'm just following orders, are you still morally responsible? Can obedience ever excuse wrongdoing? Welcome back to the Anatomy of Morality, episode 3. If you haven't watched the previous episodes yet and learned the moral framework we're currently using, I strongly encourage you to start there first. So today we will examine the case of the Nazi doctor, a scenario that raises one of the most important questions in moral philosophy. Where does personal responsibility begin? Where does it end? And can authority ever remove it? Can you delegate moral responsibility? And we're going to analyze it using, of course, the 6 conditions of moral judgment. So just to reiterate the case, you are a doctor living under a totalitarian regime. Think about Nazi Germany. And you can try and think about a figure like Dr. Josef Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death, who was a German SS officer during World War II and is remembered today for some of the most hideous experiments on prisoners in the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp during World War II. You're tasked to use live prisoners to conduct some of the cruelest medical experiments known in history. You're fully aware of the fact that many of them will die and probably all of them will suffer. You tell yourself that if you refuse, someone else will do it, and if you accept the job, the person who offered it to you will be morally responsible for all the shit you'll do. Not just responsible, but also liable and accountable. But let's first understand the differences between responsibility, liability, and accountability and their implications. I hear too many people use those terms interchangeably, just like bad, evil, and immoral. So let's really just try to understand what they mean, because they all sound very similar but have very different meanings. So starting with responsibility. Responsibility means having a duty or an obligation or an official role, a job, and being the person who is expected to manage or fulfill that duty. And the word comes from the Latin verb respondere, to answer, to reply, to respond, just like in English. And it originally means someone who must respond or answer for their actions or obligations. Responsibility doesn't necessarily imply wrongdoing. A person can be responsible for something simply because it falls within their duty or control or job description or contract, any form of official agreement. Now let's talk about liability. So liability means being legally or morally subject to consequences, and particularly the obligation to compensate, to repair harm, or to face punishment for an action or a failure. And liability comes from the Latin verb ligare, to bind, to tie, very similar to ligament in English. So it means bound or tied or obligated, which reflects the idea of being bound by a duty or by a consequence. Liability usually requires a connection between a person and the harmful outcome, making them subject to a claim or a penalty or a punishment. Accountability means being required to explain, to justify, and to answer for one's decisions, actions, and outcomes. And accountability, just like the word account, derives from the Latin verb computare, if I'm not mistaken, very similar to compte in French, to count, calculate, give an account. Compte means an account in French, and compter means counting. So unlike responsibility, which implies having a duty or a job or a role, Accountability focuses on being called upon to explain and defend how that duty was carried out. And to illustrate it better, I like to use the airline example. So imagine you're a passenger on a flight and the pilot accidentally or maybe deliberately lands the plane a little too aggressively, and as a result it causes some minor or maybe even major damage to passengers. So you can say the pilot was responsible to operate the plane safely. It's part of his job after all, and that's what they usually get paid for. The airline will also absorb some of the responsibility for ensuring proper training or safety procedures and guidelines. Now, if the investigation finds out that the incident was caused by the pilot's negligence, then the pilot may be liable as well, possibly even charged with penalties or fired, probably fired. They may even be legally bound to compensate the passengers, but most likely the airline would absorb the damage and bear most of the liability, and then perhaps even fire the pilot. After the incident, the pilot and the airline management or their legal department must provide an explanation or a statement about what happened, right? The public wants to know, the passengers want to know. So they need to explain what happened, why it happened, and what will be done to prevent it from happening again. This is accountability, being required to answer for decisions and actions. So that said, back to our original case, we can say the Nazi doctor is definitely responsible for all the damage. He's being paid for it after all. He accepted the terms and conditions of this contract. So he's definitely responsible. He's also liable or morally subject to consequences. So if he hurts someone, he will need to pay for it because nobody is forcing him to do so. That's his decision exclusively. The accountability, however, in such a situation would probably be shared between him and his management, the Third Reich, his employer, whoever is funding the research, whoever is paying him. Right. So that said, let's analyze the case against the 6 criteria of moral judgment. So criterion number 1, we start with victimhood. The first question we need to ask is there a victim? Or in other words, someone who suffered harm against their will? And of course, the answer is yes. The prisoners are all innocent individuals who were subjected to experiments without their consent. So it's not only immoral, it's also unethical as hell in medicine. Because these people are not just, patients, they're not volunteers choosing to accept risk or pain. They're not paid or compensated for all the damage. They're just, normal people. They're just people whose freedom and dignity and basic rights have been stripped away from them. Then the first condition is clearly fulfilled. The second criterion is about damage and deprivation of rights. So the second question would be, does the action cause or has the action caused real damage or deprive the victim of a fundamental right? And as explained in the previous slide, that's a pure yes. The victim suffer physical injury, psychological trauma, and in many cases, disability and even death. But the deeper issue here is not only the physical harm, it's the ugly and cynical dehumanization of innocent people. They're not even treated like the worst of slaves, but as tools for research. Their fundamental rights are violated at their very core. So, almost needless to say here, we have victims and we have real and actual damage. Next, we move to intent and awareness, and we need to ask ourselves whether the harm was caused knowingly, deliberately, or with serious apathy toward the victims. And clearly, the doctor understands what's happening. Now, he may claim stuff like, I didn't personally hate those people, or I was only doing my job, or I was just following the orders of my superiors. Or the funniest one, if I hadn't done it, someone else would have. But awareness and suffering combined with continued participation creates moral responsibility. The lack of personal hatred does not erase deliberate involvement. It simply classifies the crime differently. It's still a wrong, it's still evil, but it's not structural or systemic evil. That's all. That's the only difference. You don't need to personally desire someone's suffering, which is also known as sadism, in order to become responsible for contributing to it. If someone gives you the command and you pull the trigger, you are bearing all the moral responsibility and the consequences of your actions. So, criterion number 4, lack of justification. Was there a sufficient moral justification for the action? This is where the defense of I was just following orders usually appears, right? But again, morally speaking, it doesn't matter which authority gives the order. A government, institution, or leader cannot transform an immoral act into a moral one simply by commanding it. If someone gives the order to commit a wrongdoing and you knowingly carry it out, you still bear the moral responsibility. And going back to the World War II example, the Holocaust itself was 100% legal under Nazi Germany laws. That doesn't make it morally acceptable. And it's important to use this example to understand the distinction between morality and legality, because they're not the same. The worst crimes ever performed against humans were almost always committed by the bodies and institutions who also, believe it or not, enforce the laws for you and define them. Governments, militaries, police, courtrooms, other law enforcement agencies. It's almost never some, local gang or bandit in your neighborhood. When you hear about hundreds of thousands or millions being murdered at once, you can be 100% sure this is the work of a government. So again, legality and morality are not the same thing. We've seen it through history. We've seen it quite recently, actually, during the COVID slippery slope. We keep seeing it in theocracies and dictatorships across the Middle East and in China. So a society can approve something, a government can legalize something, an institution can demand something, and none of these automatically make it morally right. Obedience only explains someone's behavior, but explanation is not justification. We move to an alternative course. So the question is, was there another possible course of action? This is probably the most difficult condition. In reality, people living under oppressive regimes may face fear, threats for their lives, punishment, and sometimes impossible choices. In Iran, they would literally hang you for saying something against the government. In China, people are not allowed to speak about the government. So in such situations, refusal may bring serious consequences and involve some degree of danger. But personal risk does not automatically make participation morally acceptable. We're not asking, was the choice easy? We're asking, was there a morally acceptable alternative? And in this hypothetical case, we'll just assume that the doctor had the possibility to step aside quietly, but chose not to. And if not quietly, then simply run away or try to make some excuses. But back in Nazi Germany, that was a full-time job, and Josef Mengele showed no remorse or guilt for his actions at Auschwitz until his death in 1979 in Brazil, if I'm not mistaken. And the last one is disproportionality, that says if there was justification, did the harm exceed what that justification reasonably required? And in this case, the previous condition already fails. There is no legitimate moral justification for deliberately violating innocent people's fundamental rights. Therefore, proportionality becomes almost irrelevant here. However, even if someone attempted to argue that there was some greater purpose, such as scientific progress or national interest, the harm would still be completely disproportionate. The systemic suffering and destruction of innocent human lives, including children and the women, cannot and will not be justified by appeals to ideology, obedience, research, or any form of social benefit. So our verdict is, of course, guilty as hell. All six criteria are fulfilled. There is absolutely no way anyone could come and say that it's context dependent or time dependent, regardless of the circumstances. These heartbreaking atrocities earned Josef Mengele the title the Angel of Death, and for a damn good reason. And after the Holocaust, this case revealed the differences between legal obedience and moral responsibility, together with a few brilliant experiments that came later, like the Milgram experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, the third wave, of course. They all occurred just a few decades after World War II. We're talking about the 60s and the 70s. We also learned from this that some of history's greatest atrocities were not committed only by people driven by hatred. They were enabled by ordinary people who surrendered their own moral judgment, conscience, or moral compass to a system. A person is not free from moral responsibility simply because someone above them gave them an order. An authority can influence behavior, it can create pressure, it can create fear, but it cannot remove an individual's responsibility to distinguish right from wrong, also known as common sense. It doesn't cancel one's actual karma, action, cause and effect. The ability to maintain moral judgment, even under pressure, is one of the foundations of what we call human dignity. But this raises an even harder question. What happens when an entire society believes that a harmful action is justified? Can a collective belief make an immoral act become moral? That will be the next case. So follow the Absolute Yin to feed your brains with more knowledge and less garbage, and stay tuned for our next analysis. Thank you so much for watching.